So, Dr. Eli Sheff, thanks for coming on the podcast, and it is a pleasure to have you. I was so thrilled that you said yes to the invitation, and I will intro you to our audience in the pre-roll. And longtime listeners of the show know that at this point, they can expect I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about your backstory, because even though we have the present day Dr. Eli and many questions about what she's doing now, how did you get to where you are? And you can start elementary, middle, high school, wherever it feels right for you. But I want to know your origin story.
Okay, I would say interesting. I grew up with a single mom in a time when there were not that many single moms. And even though technically she was, and you may not be able to see my air quotes, a good one, because she was a widow and not divorced. So people, like she wasn't one of those wacky women who got divorced, in the early 70s. She was widowed by the Vietnam War.
Right.
But she had just a sense of freedom. She was quite young when she had my sister and I, and just growing up in a pretty unconventional setting. She had a very exploratory personality and was very, like a feminist, and would take us to protests. We lived in Colorado, and they were still producing nuclear weapons triggers at Rocky Flats Arsenal. So I remember we tried to circle Rocky Flats. It was a big deal at the time with people holding hands, but it's hundreds of square miles around Rocky Flats.
What year was that, Eli?
Boy, I'm going to say maybe 1975, maybe. I mean, it's a very early memory of.
So you were in the single
child.
digits. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, absolutely, in the single digits. I was a little kid. I was like preschool. Aged. So just really, I mean, an incredible woman with a very open mind, especially given her upbringing. Very religious, very Catholic, and she just really broke out of that and gave my sister and I both, a lot of freedom to explore and think, and access to ideas and reading, which later, I think, in my life has really stood me in good stead, because I can read all sorts of things, and books are my friends. And I've known so many people who really find reading terrifying and don't enjoy it. And I just feel really blessed. That's one of the many, many gifts my fantastic mother bestowed upon me.
Yeah. That's wonderful. By the way, I should say, I definitely was one of those people. I'm going to be 40 this year in May, and I was one of those people who was just not into books. I wasn't a reader. And I remember like friends of mine, or even their parents, would tell me like, Robin, you don't know what you're missing here. Like, and I'd be like, no, I don't, but that transformation took a while for me to grow up and read in that way. I was just anti it. You mentioned your mom was raised in the Catholic tradition. You and your sister were not, or
very much not. Much not. When she married my father, who was Jewish, that was not allowed in 1966 Denver, very conservative. So she was literally excommunicated for marrying a Jew, which is like, in the Catholic Church, it's basically like, you're dead to us if you are excommunicated. That is a big deal. So that ended up working out great for me, because I never did. I mean, I know some things about the Catholic religion, and certainly have been to weddings and funerals and things, but she never made us go to mass.
Right.
She never taught us about the Catholic Church has some very strong views about women as a source of pollution. And I mean, it's not exclusive to the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church is not great about gender in general. And I'm very grateful that I was not raised with any religion. I mean, in the 80s, she had a woo phase of like tarot cards and crystals and shamans and channelers and things. So I definitely got a serious dose of that as well.
Well, I tell you, a large, much to the chagrin of you and perhaps the rest of the listeners, I have like 70% of me that's like, yeah, let's take that exit off the highway and go talk about that. But maybe another time, because I could easily just eat up all of our time with that alone. But that I appreciate you sharing that, and you've piqued my curiosity. Okay, so help our listeners know. I mean, for career path wise, where you are now in your career, where did the traces of that start to begin in terms of areas of interest, et cetera? Yeah.
So I think because of that upbringing, that very open-minded and exploratory upbringing, I've always been interested in the margins of society. I've always felt kind of on the edge of normalcy myself. And interested in those other people who were out there on the edges with me. Like, what are you doing out here? How are you doing? And that kind of came to a head when I was 22, I met this person I just fell in love with. And they said they never wanted to be monogamous and never wanted to get married. I was like, I don't understand. Like, at first, I didn't take it that seriously because I didn't think we were going to be together, really. But then when I realized, oh man, I'm like in love the way I've never been in love before. Like, I am head over heels for this person. Now I'm like, what do you mean? You don't want to be monogamous? You don't want to get married? Like, I haven't been dreaming of Barbie's dream wedding this whole time, but I also don't know how to fit that in my world conception when you say you want a serious, ongoing, permanent relationship, but not monogamous and not married. I'm not exactly sure how that fits.
Right. Well, I don't have a container for that, basically.
Exactly. I was just like, and a very big part of me was like, well, do you just not want to be monogamous because I'm not pretty enough? I'm not good enough in bed. Like, is there something wrong with me that you need other partners? So when I heard people talking about polyamory, heard the word, I was like, oh, this is what he's been saying the whole time. I need to check this out because these people seem to be able to do it. And I'm over here like really losing my shit about feeling very upset about this relationship style. So I went and initially approached polyamory as what I think of as a civilian. And maybe if you're listening, you can't see the air quotes, but just to see what, how people did it, very interested in it because of my own life, wondering how to manage this. And because I am an intellectual, I intellectualize things that frighten me. So after a couple of years of hanging out with the polyamorous folks, I was like, all right, I got to study this. I got to figure this out. So that kind of accidentally started what's become the longitudinal polyamorous family study. So I started that in 1996 and it's ongoing. And I, ironically, fully understand it now, but it hasn't changed my heart, ironically. Like, I am a monogamous person at core. I have a singular heart. When I'm in love with someone, I am really just not interested in other people.
In sharing, in being in sharing or being shared.
I'm not drawn to other people. If my partner wants other partners, I can manage that as
Right.
long as they are meeting my needs, as long as I feel really well loved and my needs for attention and affection and sex and
Mhm.
all the things. If that's met, then I can deal with my partner having other people.
Right.
I'm just not interested
Right.
in
No, and that's an important distinction, the idea when you speak about it from your whole heart to say as long as my whole heart is cared for with all of the needs, right? Physical, emotional, sexual, etc., then there's porosity in the relationship. I'm not bothered, right?
Well, I'm somewhat bothered.
Well,
It comes at a cost.
well, I knew we would eventually get to that because that's a understandable experience. But what there was something you were talking about as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, saying there was you didn't use the word insecure part, but part of you was feeling maybe afraid or
I would say insecure. That's a good call.
okay,
Absolutely insecure.
okay. Right. And to me, as someone also who's I've been told by multiple supervisors, I'm a very rational or analytical or intellectual was the word you said. The idea is like, okay, like if I don't understand something and it also happens to be threatening, like, well then let me dive in very, very deep and very, very wide and just know this thing inside and out, upwards, downwards, back in time, right? All of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So when that relationship happened in your early 20s, and that was your window into even the idea, because you said like as a civilian, what did you first, upon your journey of discovery, what did you encounter? I mean, this is a big question, obviously, but like, what did you encounter? What was the first thing that was striking to you in exploring this territory as a up until that time, a monogamous partner, lover, etc.?
Yeah. I would say how well my personality fit with the whole polyamorous scene. Like it felt like I had found my people, kind of. And that's been a pattern over my life, is that I tend to be attracted to polyamorous people, which kind of sucks when you're monogamous. I've had this repeated thing of being the mono in a monopoly relationship. And I
Mm,
think what it is their sense of freedom and their willingness to question convention really attracts me
mm,
to that kind of idea, that kind of person who's like, what's out here on the margins? What's out here on the edges? That's who I'm interested in.
right, right.
Um, so that really stood out to me, and I think contributed to my confusion about
Mm,
whether I was polyamorous or not, because it sure seemed like I kept falling for the poly folks, and I could understand polyamory. And when I wasn't in love, I could date people who were dating other people, and I really didn't care. Like it
right.
didn't hurt at all. Um, and then when I fell in love again, it was much more so again about like meshing with someone who then turned out to be polyamorous. I wasn't choosing for that, but it happened again.
Do we? I mean, and then the other thing is, do we do we ever really choose? You know what I mean? Like
Who to fall
falling.
in love with?
Yeah, yeah. Hence the term fall, right?
Right, right. I think for some people who are aromantic, they can have a lot more control over, how their feelings about other people influence what they will do.
Sure.
Because when I'm in love, I have made some bad choices
Hmm.
because I've been like, anything for this relationship. I will do anything for
Oh
this
yeah.
relationship. I'm so devoted when I'm in love, and I would love to be able to dial that back a little bit, but it's like a fire hose. It's either on or it's off.
Yeah.
There's no a little bit for me there, I guess.
Yeah, and I hear that as making compromises. I mean, for example, I immediately think of a relationship I was in which I think I've discussed this on air before, but I put it this way. It's sort of the ugliest version of myself that was able to come out into this world. That whole version of me came alive in relationship with this person and was allowed to come alive because of sort of compromises. I don't know about sacrifices, but like, you know, a compromise is not necessarily a betrayal, but there's a depth of being like, oh, I like on the other side of it, the clarity of being on the other side of it, be like, oh wow, I like buried part of myself, or I betrayed a part of myself, you know. So
I screwed that one up.
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. There was this is the other thing I was thinking was, you know, you have a sociology background, right? Did you studied in undergrad, got a master's degree in sociology, or
I have a PhD in sociology.
PhD in sociology.
My undergraduate degree is in dance, actually.
Oh, okay.
African dance.
Okay.
And choreography. And then my PhD, I did started the longitudinal polyamorous family study as my dissertation research.
Mm-hmm.
And that has actually really influenced my findings over time. Because when you do research in a university, they have an oversight board that says how you have to structure it so that you don't hurt people on accident with your research. And that evolved over time for good reason, because in the past, we've done some pretty shady, not me, but academia and researchers have done some pretty shady things to get data. So they evolved for a good reason, but in my case, at least, they went way overboard in trying to be protective in such a way that it really hampered my ongoing study. So they said that I couldn't keep any identifying information about my respondents. So I couldn't keep their real names or their email addresses, nothing like that. So the dissertation comes and goes. I'm writing that up thinking I'm done with that and I'm going to move on to a new thing, which happens to be BDSM, because so many of my initial respondents mentioned BDSM and this intersection between polyamory and BDSM. I had never heard of BDSM before. I didn't know what it was. So my second strike research, that what they call it, is looking now at BDSM. But while I'm doing that, lots of people are asking me, but I'm still writing and presenting on my findings about polyamory. Lots of people in my presentations at conferences are asking me, how does this happen? Like, how does it go long term? What's the longevity prospect of this? And how does it impact the children? And I was like, you know what? Those are great questions. I'm going to check back in. But the way I was able to check back in is to put the word out on polyamorous leaning websites and group chats. And this was before Facebook, or I would have done it there. But like, if you've already spoken to me, I would love to hear from you again. Please get in touch with me so I can ask you how things are going now. That means that there's this entire kind of person missing from my sample, the kind of person who in those 5 intervening years was like, oh, this sucks. I don't like this. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm leaving. So the people who stuck around to hear about the ongoing research are the ones who are probably more satisfied with polyamory and satisfied enough that they're going to still talk to me almost 30 years later. So I characterize that as kind of an optimistic sample, that these are kind of the happiest or the most functional, certainly longevity, people still interested in polyamory after all this time, and their children who are still willing to talk to me. Maybe I met them when they were in preschool and now they've graduated from college and have children of their own, kind of. So I always like to preface my findings I think it's an important way to understand it. That said, while these are the happiest of the polyamorous families, they are characteristic of many other mainstream polyamorous folks in that age group. So the parental age group is Gen X and the younger baby boomers.
Mm-hmm.
And the children age group are the younger millennials and the Zoomers from my sample. And I would say that of those age groups, this sample is pretty representative of the mainstream polyamorous community. Now there's this whole, now that the millennials are also part of the mainstream polyamorous community, I would say things are different for them. People coming into polyamory as millennials, I think, are doing it differently than the Gen Xers and the baby boomers did it to some extent.
Yeah, I'm curious for you to expand on that. What are some of the differences you're noticing?
I would say it's much more widespread and popularized now. So a whole different kind of person is finding out about it. Those people, the parental folks in my sample, were kind of early adopters, is a phrase some people might recognize. From the second wave, I would say, of the third wave of polyamory.
Early adopters from the perspective of our culture, because I'm
Right.
dog-earing a page of the sociology of like, surely Dr. Eli has looked at consensual non-monogamy through history and in other cultures and stuff. I have to imagine. Yeah, but anyway. Yeah.
And I'm speaking more specifically about polyamory. Most consensual non-monogamies across history have been polygyny, which is one husband with multiple wives. We have seen that, and by we, I mean sociologists, historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, kind of people looking at culture. We've seen pretty much in every society we can identify, powerful, wealthy men have multiple partners if they want them. You know, I think what's really different about polyamory specifically is not only the depth of emotional connection, but that women are having multiple partners. That's the huge difference now from how most multiple partnerships have been historically. Polyandry, or one wife with multiple husbands, is comparatively quite rare and happens under kind of very specialized circumstances, whereas polygyny happens under many different as long as the dude is wealthy and powerful, then it happens in all sorts of kind of ways. You know, sometime anyway, I'm not going to go further into that, but yes, I'm talking about early adopters of the third wave of polyamory. The first one was like the anarchist movement of the 1880s, like Emma Goldman era. The second one, I would say, was in the 60s, with the 60s and 70s, with the free love and the kind of open marriage, group marriage experiments. And then now we're in the third one of kind of the impact of technology. The internet and social media have had a huge impact. So I'm comparing these early adopters that came at the beginning of the third wave. And now folks who are entering, like, at the third wave is really huge, 3 times as big as it was when the parental generation of my sample started. So I would say the early adopters who started it much earlier with the technology, tended to be white, highly educated, middle and upper middle class professionals. Not that they were the only people doing it, but they were the folks who felt comfortable enough to participate in research. Now, I would say it's really shifted social classes, that initially it was the kind of easier to be out about it and to label it as polyamory, identify it with that term specifically, was kind of a white hippie educator, lawyer, doctor, healthcare professional, highly educated. Now I would say like people in their 30s, people in their 20s are having a very different view of it. And for those folks, if they can afford to buy a house and get married and have children, they can afford a more isolated or atomized existence, nuclear existence, they're more likely to at least consider monogamy. But for a lot of people who are living in shared housing, who can't afford to have children, who probably aren't going to get married because spending $80,000 on a wedding that may or may not last is not something they're interested in. They may have a smaller ceremony or something. Some of them do marry, but it's not this same kind of Barbie's dream wedding and McMansion that the upper middle class is getting. So I find the class implications really interesting, that younger people are almost seeing polyamory as part of this more integrated communal life, less kind of sectioned off into smaller chunks of couple, and more individual in a group setting is much more common. And we saw that they've been at this for years, because they used to do the group dating, like when they were young. Millennials blew everybody's minds because they did group dating. Like, they didn't date the way former generations had dated, and social scholars were like, what are they doing? My God. And I would say that's carried forward also, that they see monogamy as an option, absolutely, but it's something you've got to figure out and discuss. It's not this kind of thing that you've only have to discuss if you want to deviate from it, which was past relations. Gen X certainly had that idea. For millennials, just the fact that you've been seeing each other for a while and having sex for a while does not mean you are exclusive. And if you assume, oh, we've had sex 3 times, we've been on a few dates and we've had sex 3 times, that means we're a thing, right? No, not necessarily. You might be a thing, but you don't know until you have a define the relationship talk, which means, are we monogamous? And what does monogamy mean? Does that include going to strip clubs? Does that include sending your ex emojis on Facebook on their birthday? Heart emojis, flower emojis.
Right. What are the boundaries? Yes.
Exactly. In a way that previous generations did not have to explore that.
Yeah, I remember to share the story just for our audience. My buddy, my now wife, before we were boyfriend girlfriend in my 20s, we were I think we were like going to a Washington Capitals Pittsburgh Penguins hockey game, right? And my buddy was like, "Is she your girlfriend?" And I hadn't yet, like, we hadn't had that conversation. but like you had shared earlier, like when you were speaking about your heart, my heart knew. We just hadn't had that conversation yet. And so my buddy, the fact that he asked that question kind of like at the game or like after the game, like, it wasn't a twisting of my arm, but I was like, I need to have that conversation like right now. Like, I needed to have that conversation like months ago. But when people do start to have that conversation about what are we, without making assumptions, I'm curious about some of the common challenges that people encounter, because you're an expert and you help people navigate their relationships, and you're also AASECT sex certified. And I've had other sex therapists on the podcast who, at least one of them have said in our conversations, like, the number one challenge that people come in for sex therapy is like the interest. Now we're talking about monogamous couples, I think usually heterosexual couples, but like the number one challenge is like one of the partners wants to have sex more than the other partner. That's the most common thing. Now, but when we brought in the sample size of people who are selecting for going to see a relationship expert, and we're now including folks who are polyamorous but don't know it yet, when they start to have that conversation, what are some of the questions or reactions or challenges from your deep experience? Just share with our listeners what you know.
I see three primary things, I guess I would say. The first one is that it's really easy to imagine yourself having multiple partners, because you're like, oh yeah, I love this person, but that cutie, how interesting. And that one, what fun. From the I get multiple partners, it's fun and easy to consider that. But I'm going to be hanging out with the kids for the weekend while my partner goes with their sweetie to Mexico on their anniversary trip. That's a lot harder for a lot of people. It's much more difficult to have their partner that they really love or feel strongly connected to go off with someone else. That's the rub, not the being open. The fun part is having multiple partners. Yeah. So it's ironic that I'm the opposite. Like, a polymono person is often the opposite of that. And that's one of the things I see. The second one, I guess, is where one person wants an exclusive relationship and someone else wants an open relationship. And that's very challenging. That can work if both people can stretch in towards each other, so that the person who wants an open relationship, the relationship is probably more closed than their ideal. And the person who wants an exclusive relationship, the relationship is probably more open than their ideal. But if they're both accommodating and stretching towards the other, it can work, with all sorts of other caveats and things. But it's a fragile thing that takes a lot of care and feeding to maintain. The third thing I see a lot is issues around family. Either some people wanting kids, other people not wanting kids, some people wanting to be really out to their larger family, other people wanting to be more closeted, who gets to be defined as family. A lot of polyamorous relationships develop into what they call polycules, which are connections among multiple people who are all connected through polyamorous relationships, but are generally not all lovers with everybody. You might have, for instance, 8 people in a polycule, but 5 of them never sleep with each other, but they're sleeping with other people within the polycule, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Yeah.
So family issues I see arising a lot. Those 3 probably are the difficulties of sharing, the relationship orientation mismatch, and family issues, I think, are the 3 things that people really need to deeply consider when they're considering opening their relationships or embarking on an already open relationship.
Right. I mean, I was thinking about just the challenge. Take kids out of it for a moment, right? Just that's another layer. And when you began to talk about it, saying it's easier to imagine that you're the one that can have multiple partners. So the moment you said that, I had a part of me that was like, that's not going to be easier for me. Like, be like one relationship is it's like I'm holding a mug full of tea right now. One relationship, the metaphor is that like that's anything more than that, it's gonna spill all over me. You know what I mean? Like it's right. So when you were presupposing, well, that's the easy. Now you weren't saying everyone will find that easy. Obviously, for monogamous couples, it's not their jam. But to say your point is taken, the harder thing emotionally is when you're the one who's got to stay home with the kids, and then one of your partners goes, or if it's the mono poly, your partner goes and goes to Mexico or whatever. And I was thinking, oh yeah, the fact that it's like they're like drinking something at the pool bar while these kids are fighting and won't clean up their mess or whatever, right? Like that's a whole other level of, I don't know if resentment is the right word, but certainly just like, yeah, I don't know, like a bitterness, or I mean, when there's not an agreement, yeah, it seems like such a recipe or trappings for conflict. But again, people do it, and they do it when they can have honest, open communication about expectations, and that also knowing that expectations are not just some snapshot, and it's like they're dynamic and they change. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to pick your brain about is what are some of your like pro tips for folks who actually, maybe we should back up for a second. I'm trying to address a portion of the audience where, let's just imagine for the sake of argument that they somehow this is the first conversation about this concept of consensual non-monogamy or polyamory, and they're scratching their heads. And I'm trying to kind of play Joe Schmo here right now, say like, okay, how is that? What are some of the like frequently asked questions, or some of the main, like when people are like, I'm skeptical that, she keeps saying like, people can make this work. I think that's horseshit. I think they can't. I think people are lying to themselves. Blah, blah. Like that kind of perspective. I wonder if you could speak to, validating that perspective, but also enlightening or illuminating, the limitations of that perspective. Do you get my question?
Absolutely. Kind of underneath what I'm hearing is, does polyamory work?
Yeah, it's one way to ask the question.
And that's what I hear a lot. People ask, or they'll make the statement, whatever, that sounds fine, but it doesn't really work.
Right.
And for me, it really depends on how we define what's working or not. This kind of traditional sense of, you don't know if a relationship has worked until someone dies. And then if you were successful in establishing that relationship in one form and then maintaining that form across time until someone dies, then in retrospect, it worked. If that's the measure, then no, polyamory doesn't work, and monogamy doesn't work either. Relationships don't work because well over half of marriages end before someone dies, end in divorce. So if we expand that out to even non-marital relationships, that's just not the way relationships work. And it was easier to do that when you could expect 200 years ago, one of you at least would be dead by 40. And it was a much shorter time horizon for working. Now, when we're looking at, you can be 40 and still have another 50 years with this person. And what if you're miserable the whole time? It's very different. So I would say, if we look, however, at if work means meets people's needs for a specific period of time and changes over time to accommodate shifting circumstances, then absolutely, polyamorous relationships can work. They're difficult to establish. They have a very high attrition rate at first. That first year has a super steep learning curve. Where people are trying to figure out, like, how do we fit together? All of us, how do we like hang together and create something that feels comfortable and sustainable for everyone. And like back to our example of someone whose sweetie is off in Mexico while they're with the kids, at first, maybe that really sucks. And they're bummed out. By the third time, they think about, okay, yes, they're in Mexico right now, but 2 months ago, I went to Alaska with my sweetie. So it's not like I'm always the one stuck at home with the kids. And I made plans for this weekend. My partner's going to be gone, but the kids and I have a play date. We're going to have a slumber party. We're having a movie night. You know, I'm not just sitting there crying into my cold mac and cheese thinking about my partner eating lobster. You know, like I'm doing things to have fun. And it took a while to figure that out, you know, generally. So if they can make it over that hump, often they can establish a steady state of really mutual support. The happy ones have very high relationship satisfaction. But it involves a lot of folding laundry and dropping kids off in their carpool. And, you know, it doesn't make for great reality TV. A happy polycule is often pretty boring. What makes much better reality TV, and it's the face of polyamory that a lot of people see, is the searching phase where emotions are high and the challenging, like, how do we fit together? How do we establish the fit? So if that's all you ever see, then polyamory looks explosive and unstable and really outlandish. But if all you ever saw of monogamy was 90 Day Fiancé or Love is Blind or, you know, some other reality show where people are doing wacky monogamous things, and that was your entire view of monogamy, you'd be like, that's a hot mess. I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. You know, you agree, you barely know someone, and then you agree to spend your life together. Of course, it's going to turn out to be terrible. You didn't even know that person, and now you're professing deep love for them. That's stupid. You know, so this reality TV version of polyamory that is the most inflammatory is also the most accessible or the most popular. Whereas there's a lot of people having very quiet polyamorous lives so that their friends and families might not even know. And they're the ones who've had 35 years together and everything is fine.
I want to ask a question there. I'm not confident I'll remember it, so I need to kind of cut the line. And there's another. So you said the 1 year attrition rate. Like I'm associating to the 7 year itch for traditional monogamous relationships and marriages or whatever. Like the 7 year itch is when relationships go to therapy or end in divorce or whatever it is. And you were saying for polyamorous couples, it's that steep learning curve of about 1 year, but if you can make it over the hump. So is it, in your research, you find that it is about 1 year, or is there variance? Is it 6 to 18 months or say more about that?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of them don't make it a full year.
Okay.
No, it's within that first year. Like if you're able to get over, and I wouldn't say it's just couples. I would say it's the entire relationship constellation. So there could be, let's say, a triad that's been doing great. You know, they've been moving along for 7 or 8 years. They're copacetic. And then one member gets a new sweetie. Then the whole triad has to adjust to this new person being a serious relationship. They need to redistribute time, attention, money, you know, kind of relational legitimacy.
Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah.
It gets to take up space.
Right. I mean, that's right. I mean, you're talking about the system of individuals in a relationship. Your example is a triad, and it's like, well, then if there's a new take a new individual into that system, all of a sudden it's new negotiations around resources, basically. And every single time that adjustment happens, I guess the assumption I'm making is the entire system is potentially vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Unless there's this like core, I mean, like my first even awareness of polyamorous relationships, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I think it's HBO Big Love is like responsible, right? Like,
right, for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I also, forgive me, I'm bouncing around here a little bit, but I'm also curious, in your experience, what do you feel like pop culturally have been some of the this is the question that I was concerned I wouldn't get to, but how do I ask this? It's twofold question. One is, I don't know, the first like throuple that came onto like daytime, like I don't know if they talked to Oprah or like Dr. Phil or whoever or whatever, but I'm curious about cultural, at least in the US, like cultural milestones where the greater public at large was like, hey, are you aware of this? And as opposed to something just being like on the margins, for example, like you say, and it's in the mainstream, it's in the spotlight. I'm curious of like instances in your life that you have taken note of in our culture that have shown more light onto the phenomena, that this is an option and can be done in a way that's mutually satisfying to all parties. Then the other question, so just pocket that for a second. And then the other question is the one around like when a relationship system has kids and then we have play dates or sleepovers or things like that, how do folks negotiate being open or addressing fears or concerns that partners have about like, well, they're not gonna invite us to birthday parties if they know that we're a thing because of like that stigma. So these two questions are kind of related regarding how much is the culture accepting and aware. So do you take them wherever you want in terms of order? Yeah.
I would say that culture has become significantly more aware, and the level of acceptance, again, really varies by generation. The boomers are fairly freaked out about it. Some of them, though, are long-term
That's right.
polyamorists, those boomers. Like, some of them are the OG polyamorous from the 60s. So it's not like they're universally freaked out, but they are more freaked out than the Gen Xers, who are a little more open to it. The millennials are like, yeah, of course. And the Gen Z folks are like, oh, that's cliche. Like it's so popular. So cliche. Of course, polyamory, whatever, or open, like relationship diversity. Gender and sexual diversity has just dramatically increased. And I would put a lot of this down to the internet and social media, people being able to find each other. So I guess I would say, rather than these kind of pivotal zeitgeist moments, it's been this slow kind of snowballing of exponential growth, more so, with the advent of Facebook. There's a zillion groups on Facebook for polyamory. Reddit has a lot happening around polyamory. Meetup, that kind of place to go where to find in your local area, like who's doing knitting, who's doing bird watching.
You know what? Right. But I take your point that I totally take your point that like tech is really, like you said, the internet and social media in terms of access, that the culture now has multiple points of entry, and that would be different than like all the Sunday Meet the Press, Face the Nation, like all the there's a mainstream that either does or does not touch this stuff at all. And that's kind of what I was like wondering if you associate it to any memories of like a big, like, oh, this is a big moment for the polyamory community, because now we're being represented in this like hit TV show or like this movie that won an Oscar. So like that's kind of what I mean. Because I totally take your point about tech. Like, yeah, there's access and it changes generationally. And also those access points are accessed by the folks who are participating. And also there could be folks on Facebook that are totally oblivious to all these groups. You know what I mean?
Yes. You know who I think would be great for that question is Alan M. And he has done polyamory in the media for at least the last 20 years. He is the one who can answer that question because he has dedicated hundreds of hours to tracking the media and collecting it. So if you have any interest in polyamorous representation in the media, check out, I think the site is either called Polyamory in the Media or Polypercolations, maybe. Something like that. But it's Alan M. Would be a much better person for that question. Because from my perspective, it's this big snowball thing, but Alan could absolutely tell you those pivotal things.
Sure.
In terms of family and children, your question was about stigma. Like, do the children experience stigma?
It's actually about the caregivers. You know, it was focused on stigma. It's about like the fact that there are, fears about so many things, but these specific fears that are sort of nested in the relationship system and how the relationship is already speaking, hopefully, openly and honestly about boundaries and expectations. And then one of those facets is, like birthday parties, sleepovers, play dates, and openness. And is there sort of like, I'm kind of curious what that looks like in terms of if one partner or member of that system is like, I'm totally freaked out about the idea of being like coming out to so-and-so, and just how all that, I don't know that there's a clear, I don't know that I'm making sense, but I am curious about the fear of being who you are and how and how that fear can maybe be limiting and even limit the children that are in that relationship system. I
think some polyamorous parents are very nervous with good reason. Some people have lost custody of their children, and I can talk about my expert witness practice and how kind of I've seen judicial bias in family courts evolve over time in that arena. But first, let's talk about how do the parents feel about it? Generally, with small children, they don't notice adult relationships that much. They're not clued in that much to how the adults are interacting with each other. Little kids are much more about how does the adult interact with me? Do they bring ice cream? Will they sit on the floor and play with me? You know, like, will they stay and watch the kind of TV I want to watch, or are they watching boring adult TV? You know, like Paw Patrol. Will they watch Paw Patrol with me or not? So from the children's perspective, even when they're socializing with each other small children, they're not that clued in on precisely the interactions among the adults. They're more about, I'm getting all this attention, and that is nice. I'm getting more presence. So if they do notice a difference between themselves and their peers, it's usually that they have more stuff and more people. You know, like their peers are at a disadvantage because they have less.
Attention, but by the way, attention being the most precious. I mean, talk about like more gifts or whatever, but just adult attention. Go ahead.
I don't know. 8-year-olds are all about the gifts. They want loot, you know, like they're like, give me presents. Give me, it's my birthday. I want all the things. I want my birthday to last for 2 weeks. I want cake and presents every day. And attention is good too, but they are frequently, loot is kind of like attention in hard form.
Yeah, of
You
course,
know,
of course.
you know what?
And it makes sense to me that they're not as clued in on the adult activity. They're just more appreciative of just their lived experience in the present moment with the peer class, the subsystem of kids in that.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yes, more focused with each other on what are we going to play? Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? And the adults are pretty much vehicles to deliver snacks and rides.
Yeah.
Like they've
Yeah.
got their place, but
Yeah.
it's not in the play,
Yeah.
So the adults will often kind of just not address it directly with the peers. They don't need to point it out. And the peers don't really notice that much. Occasionally, the peers' parents will notice and ask questions. But even then, so many families have multiple parents in them, usually via divorce. So people are very used to having extra adults around.
Right.
There's mom and her new husband and dad with his new boyfriend all at the soccer game.
Right.
So in that way, polyamorous families don't tend to stand out that much unless something draws attention to them. They pass under the radar as couples with good friends that hang out a lot, or divorced people who like each other still, So doesn't require a lot of explanation frequently. Often when explanation is required, they let the children handle it if it's with their peers. Like the kids have information supremacy in that arena, and they get to disclose how and when it's appropriate for them. If, for instance, they want to have a sleepover, sometimes they'll ask for household supremacy or sleepover supremacy. Like, I'm having my friends over tonight. Could you please not have your partners over tonight? Okay, sure. Or if you're going to go on a date, leave the house for the date and then come back. So we just don't even have to explain. Because once you get into tweens and teens, especially, notice in a whole different way than the elementary schoolers do. They're like putting things together in a way that a little kid won't. And so for those folks, sometimes it's easier just not even to have it around. If you're having a 15th birthday party and you don't want your mom and dad's boyfriend hanging out, you could ask, please don't have Jerome over tonight. Or if you are going to hang with Jerome, why don't the two of you go out to Jerome's place? The keg is coming at 9. I would love it if you weren't here,
Yeah, we all know if Jerome shows up, Jerome's going to talk to all my friends, so he can't be there.
Right, exactly. And the parents then say, no, you cannot have a keg for 16 people. No, you are not allowed to do that. So I don't want it to seem like the polyamorous parents are like, sure, have a kegger, kiddo. They have parental boundaries, and giving a house full of 16-year-olds a keg of beer is not within that idea of often flying under the radar. They don't like that would be terrible judgment, and it would draw a lot of danger potentially and attention. They don't want to make those huge mistakes. So they tend, ironically, their parenting tends to err on the side a little bit of slightly conservative with their own and other people's children in terms of what they will allow to happen, because they can't afford the scrutiny that would come with a kegger for 16-year-olds.
Makes sense. Yeah, I appreciate you speaking to that, and I'm very curious when you mentioned, and I knew we would get to it, but your expert witnessing and losing custody, and just please feel free to share a story to the degree that it's not identifying, right? But just your experiences. Tell listeners about maybe some of those considerations that haven't been considered, right? About what happens in these relationships with custody.
Up until about 8 to 10 years ago, if someone's custody of their child was challenged on the grounds that they were polyamorous, they always lost their children every time.
You said the last 10 years?
Yeah, that was 8 or 10 years ago. Like, so for 15 at least years before that, people would lose their kids.
I'm guessing also beyond, like in the 60s.
Oh yeah,
Like, yeah. But just like, but there was a shift in the last 10 years. Yeah.
Yes. So I have seen a shift away from this kind of knee-jerk take the kids away.
Right.
Towards still judicial bias, assuming polyamory is unstable, assuming polyamorous parents have bad sexual boundaries with no evidence. So this judicial bias now expresses not as everyone loses their children, everyone who's polyamorous loses their children, but restrictions around the kinds of families polyamorous people are allowed to have. So judges are putting in place lots of restrictions around who can be in the house when they have their children. So they can't have their partners around when they have their children. They can't have sex when their children are in the house.
Oh boy.
They can't, talk to their children about their partners, things like that. So what that means in practice or in application is that polyamorous families are facing far greater restrictions, such heavy restrictions that they almost cannot have families. If your family has multiple partners, but they have to leave every time you have your children, you're basically saying you cannot have a family because your family has to live somewhere else.
And I am immediately what I'm immediately noticing as I hear you describe that, Eli, is the sort of heartbreak that kind of restriction is sort of an extreme protection, right? It's coming out of like that. This is how I make sense of it. It's coming out of an extreme fear about the unwanted harm or damage to the child. And yet, and this is classic. I'm an IFS guy, internal family system. So the classic thing is that we were talking about this before we went on air, that the protector gives rise to the thing that it's actually trying to protect against. So it's like we don't want to hurt these kids, and then the restrictions come in, and then it's like, oh, but by the way, now we're like amputating a relationship here without yeah. So
and they're doing it in the name of family stability. They're worried about the polyamorous family being unstable, but they are creating the instability by requiring this. And they require things of polyamorous families they are not requiring of monogamous families. Think about, for instance, this rule of you can't have sex while your children are in the house. How does a monogamous family ever have a second child? Of course parents have sex when their children are in the home. You can't get a babysitter every time you want to have sex with your spouse.
That's what Paw Patrol is for. No, I'm kidding.
But lots and lots and lots of parents put the children to bed, go in their own bedroom, close the door.
That's right.
And then have their sex. That's the way parents have done it. And polyamorous parents have adult private sex, even when their kids are in the house, generally after the kids are asleep. That's why you put your kids to bed at 8 o'clock. So you can have a little bit of time to unwind and have some adult time. So I'm thinking, for instance, of this one family where it had been a polyamorous triad originally. One of the women from that triad split off and was angry at those folks and was like, I don't want to do polyamory anymore. So she decided polyamory was bad. She then cheats with a married man, breaks up his marriage. They get married, and now they want custody of the babies she had when she was with these other people. These other people now have had another girlfriend. They've been together for 7 years. They move together. The threesome moves together to be closer to the children. The homewrecker, the monogamous homewrecker, and her new husband are now pregnant with another child. So clearly they've been having sex, not only when he was married to someone else, but now with their own children in the home, they've been having sex because they're going to have a second kid. They've been together for maybe 3 years. The judge interprets the cheating 3-year relationship as more stable than the 7-year openly conducted relationship, and says, this woman that you have living with you, she cannot be there when the children are there. So now half the time she's got to find somewhere else to live while the children are with the family. It's absolutely ridiculous. When they ask the judge, like, what would convince you of the stability? Because we have the honesty, we have the longevity, we have the commitment of moving states together. You know, like, what else do you need to convince you of our commitment and stability? And the judge was just like, honestly, I can't tell you. I can't even imagine. You know, so there was literally no way for them to demonstrate to the judge's satisfaction that they were a decent family, which is the definition of judicial bias. There's no evidence for parental malfeasance. It's just assumed. And the people who do have evidence of cheating on each other, lying to each other, causing divorces in other people's families, they are assumed in a shorter term relationship. They are assumed better parents with no evidence whatsoever.
That's the power of culture, right?
And judicial bias.
Judicial bias.
Compulsory monogamy is what I think Ann Tweedy called it years ago. But people also call that mononormativity. This idea that monogamy is really the only right way to be. And if you're not monogamous, then you've got to be whacked out in all sorts of ways. If you don't follow that boundary, then you must not have any other boundaries.
Well, and people vary in their tendency to be open-minded or closed-minded. That's like a given. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. Yeah, people vary in their open. And but where am I going with that? Yeah, I guess I'm like factoring in what makes for healthy relationship, and not assuming that the relationship is a dyad. That the fact that it's a dyad is not what makes it healthy.
Precisely. Yeah. There are some messed up dyadic families. Not that there aren't messed up polyamorous families. I am not saying every polyamorous family is perfect. I have no doubt some polyamorous families out there are a hot mess, and those kids might be better off in a monogamous family. Absolutely. But the assumption that polyamory equals dysfunction without any further investigation, and monogamy equals good functionality, that is so clearly erroneous. Right. Families are complicated and need to be assessed on an individual basis. The presence of monogamy doesn't make it perfect. The absence of monogamy doesn't make it perfect. And I thought I could make it until 3 before I hit the bathroom again.
Oh, human bladder.
Take a super brief break.
Let's go take a break. We'll take a break together. We'll be right back.
Okay, perfect.
And we're back. So, all right, I'm doing a time check here. Maybe it makes sense to pivot to talk about the bonding project.
Okay.
So, yeah, tell me and tell our listeners, first of all, the bonding, you started it. How did it become an idea? And then how did that idea transform into this world and become embodied?
Such a good question. I was talking to my dear friend, Jess, who is this amazing woman who I think identifies now as a relationship anarchist, but that wasn't really the terminology yet when we started talking about it. So she wasn't like labeling it as such, but she was trying to say that she's dating all these people and she constantly hears from the people she's dating, well, I don't want a relationship, but I want, and then describes like what for her is a relationship. What they don't want are these strings and expectations of exactly how that commitment will look and how they'll be able to then control the other relationships that person is having. You know, they want non-monogamous relationships, but they also want ongoing emotional intimacy and things like that. So Jess was like, I need to, when people say I don't want a relationship, I need a test I can give them to find out what they mean, because then they always describe the relationship they do want.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh my God, that's such a good idea. A relationship test that says, I want this kind of relationship. So she and I started working on it, I would have to say at least 8 years ago. And we had so many good ideas, and we were talking about these fantastic ideas, and it was always just ideas. Like it never went anywhere. There were great ideas, and its implementation that was the issue. So then the pandemic hit and everybody was on lockdown, and Jess was like, hey, you and I have been talking about this. We have done, like, it's not going anywhere. How about we add some other people to it and see if we can get it from idea to thing phase? So we added Shay and Kirk, and they, over the first year of the pandemic, helped us make it into an actual thing. And it went live online, and people were really engaged and really interested in it, that first version. And we got a lot of feedback that one test wasn't cutting it. Like we were trying to kind of glump together sex and romance and attraction and affection and like all these things that are actually separate. And we knew they were separate, but we were trying to kind of measure everything at once. And it didn't work. It worked great for some people for who sex and romance and emotion, you know, like they are all the same. But for some people, they're quite distinct. And for those people, they were like, your test doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So now we took it down and we reconfigured it completely. And now it's looking at resource specific. So it still asks if people want to bond one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many, or solo. But it doesn't ask that as a global bonding style. It asks, how about with money? How about with sex? How about with romance? How about with housing?
So each resource has its own variable. This drop-down menu of one-to-one, many-to-many, many-to-one, one-to-many, solo.
No, actually, that's the outcome, is how you want to bond. The resources ask, you know, make a statement, and they're like, so for instance, I want my own separate living quarters with no one else kind of in my space. I want, you know, to be able to maybe invite people over occasionally, but I want to do most of my socializing out with other people. That's a clear kind of residential style. And then give some options, you know, from the middle of, yeah, I could kind of go either way, to very much, you know, like almost in all circumstances, hard yes, to lean yes with some, you know, kind of depends. Like if I were really in love with my partner, I could maybe live with my partner, but nobody else. To hard no of, no, I definitely want to live in a collective home. I like to live in community. I like to be, you know, I want my partner and our children and our other partners. I want a co-housing fandango, you know, to mostly want to live with other people, but I could see living alone if I had a tiny house in a community with other people, my own space, but you know, so they can answer this range of answers that basically comes out in the results to, are you comfortable, curious, cautious, or challenged around that resource. So those things kind of all come together in a fairly complex delivery that there's 4 completely separate tests right now, and we'll be having more. We had started with time, actually. How do you want to share your time? And that one's really hard because it kind of implies how you're spending your time. Like, if you're saying you need a lot of time with partners, does that mean you and all your partners together, or you want one-on-one time? How about if that time is spent working together at home, or do you need to be like face to face making eye contact? What if you're both just watching TV and on your cell phones? Or do you need to be like taking a walk and doing something special? So time, we got so bogged down on time. We were like, let's do housing.
Sounds like
we're figuring that out. Co-parenting is probably coming up next. So we're going to look at this very kind of global idea of different facets of bonding, because people are complicated. Maybe you want sexuality to be shared, let's say, one to many. You want to have like all sorts of partners and like a lot of freedom around that. But when it comes to finances, maybe you're solo. You're like, my money is my money and I am not paying your rent, and do not expect me to pay for all the groceries or something. Or sure, I'll split things with you, but I'm not like, I've only got enough money to support myself and I'm not doing group money or something. So, and we see that a lot, actually, that people seem to have much more shared sexual boundaries, but much smaller financial boundaries is what we're finding. Like, often they are either solo or one-on-one. And we find that sexually and romantically, the one-to-many, where people have a whole bunch of options, is more appealing to most people than the many-to-many. That group relationship seems to be the least desired, where the group itself takes precedence. The many-to-many is really the kind of collective person who, and ironically, sometimes solo wraps around to many, like they're this, individual within the larger collective, and they don't want to split off into the one-to-one. They don't want these smaller atomized relationships. They really are about kind of the group well-being. So that kind of person is gonna want a group romantic relationship and a group living situation and a group, the ability maybe not to always have group sex, but they won't need necessarily a lot of one-on-one time with a partner. So if you're, for instance, really dedicated to kitchen table polyamory and you really don't want any one partnership to be more important than any other partnership for everyone within the group, you might be many-to-many. But if you are like, I've got my main boo here, and then I want to also have other lovers, you might be one-to-many. If you're like, I am a free agent, I want to do my own thing, and I'm happy for you to do your own thing too. I don't need to control you. Let's be together, not controlling each other. You might be solo. Or some solo people are like, I don't want to have sex. I'm not interested in the I'll be social with people, but really I'm more of a self-contained person. I'm not looking for a romantic connection. So I think people take all sorts of different forms. Some people are really consistent across their life. Like they have this very much this one-to-one, like when they were little kids, they had a best friend. And once they were dating, they had their date, and it was always like the two of them, you know. Some people maintain that very consistently across their lives. Other people, maybe when they're young, you know, like in their teens, they really want to kind of play the field and explore. So maybe they're one to many. Then maybe they want just one person and they're one to one for years. And then let's say they divorce or that person dies. And then they're like, I want some time by myself. I'm solo now. You know, I think that trajectory is also quite common, to have different relationship styles across time. So that's one of the things we want to do with the bonding project is, once we get the dashboard developed, we're working on the software thing. Maybe software is not even the right way to characterize it. I don't understand exactly what we're doing with that. Somehow we're doing this magical electronic thing behind the scenes that you'll be able to track your kind of, what did you say a year ago and how are you feeling now, and compare with other people. Let's say you've got a polycule of 5 people and you all take these tests. You can see in advance, oh, 3 of us have very strong collective tendencies, so we should live together, but you 2 who have very solo residential tendencies, we're not going to make you live with us. Like, you get to have your own place. Let's not even try. Or we see with co-parenting, some of us want to have kids, others prefer to be more child adjacent, but not actually an active parent. So these kind of comparisons, inner polycule comparisons, can help foresee issues down the road of, okay, we're coming together now. How do we, you know, how I was talking about that first year is often the hardest. It's figuring out those things of having the giant collective house sounds like a fantastic idea, but this person needs a lot of quiet, a lot of space, a lot of alone time. Really, the idea of living in a household with 7 other people sounds like hell to them. Maybe let's not even set up that mess from the beginning. Let's just assume they're going to keep their studio. They're not moving out of their studio to come move in with us, that kind of thing.
I mean, it's funny you said moments ago, people are complicated. I was like, that's the tagline of this episode. Right? like, yeah, well, yes, that's also already self-evident no matter any episode, but in particular, there are moments, even when you were talking about the judicial dispute and just like all of the factors, I was like, I could tell. I was like, part of my brain is starting to melt with the level of complexity. And then what I love about the bonding project, so there's 2 questions I have for this. Well, actually, one's more of a comment. So I love that it's taking something that it's making like implicit beliefs and preferences that are carried in a person's heart that may be somewhere in the shadows or in the darkness they're not consciously aware of, and it's raising it up into the light and making it explicit and saying, oh, now I actually have to do a drop down field and pick this. I guess it is this. And then to have that over time and see how people change, right? That's great. I think that's absolutely lovely. Kudos to you. And you said Jessica was the co-creator? Jess.
Co-created.
Yeah.
And now these other founders, Shay has stuck around. Kirk had stuff happen in his life, as many of us do, and just couldn't. It's a volunteer project. It costs us money, actually. So it costs a lot of time,
of course,
and, you know, money for the website and stuff like that. You know, it's not like a ton of money, thousands of dollars a month, but it's several $100 a month, and it's hard to sustain that amount of time and money on a project that's not making any money. Ideally, people will start paying us for like the comparisons, the polycule comparisons, and even a more developed, like, we'll still give the baseline results for free. But if people want a more developed, We
Right.
ideally would like to at least have the project be self-sustaining, so it can pay for its own web hosting and things like
that makes sense to me. And it also makes sense to me in terms of product packaging to have some sort of, just like all like free app in-app purchases where it's like, here's the base thing, and then the people who want the more refined thing, they're going to want, it sounds like a lot of value that you're adding. And as someone who's in a monogamous relationship, maybe this is a silly question, but I'm like, in the same service of taking like preferences from the dark and putting them into the light and making you consciously aware of it, I'm like, is this bonding project only for polyamorous folks? Right? Like,
absolutely not. No. I am a one-to-one bonder, and it's for one-to-one. It's for people who want to figure out what kind of relationship works best for them in that moment. So absolutely, the results could be one-to-one. You seem most comfortable with that. Those are my results.
yeah.
They might be, maybe you don't want a romantic relationship at all, or it might be you would do best in a primary secondary relationship with some wiggle room on the side. It's not really, I would say, this diagnostic criteria that says, yes, you are polyamorous, and that's the only result that everyone always gets. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's really wondering this whole kind of range of human bonding. Like, here are all these options. What sounds best to you right now? And underneath that, we have a few kind of goals for the bonding project. One, we want to support people finding the right form of relationship for them. So for some people, it absolutely is one-to-one. That is the right form for me too. But that's not right for everyone. And it's not right. Maybe one-to-one is right for some people at some times, and those same people might find a different kind of relationship better for them, maybe between serious relationships. Maybe when they're serious about someone, they're a one-to-one bonder, but when they're more playful, maybe, like, let's say they've just been in a super long-term relationship, they want to play around a little bit before they get in another serious relationship. Maybe that's a good time to check out one-to-many.
Yeah.
Who knows?
The thing that I'm thinking about as I appreciate the project is like you and your co-creators of this project, facilitators, sustainers, are really doing a service to preventing preventable pain. I mean, to reduce it down to the just reduction sauce, you're really saying here are all the ways in which, and then people could have disagreements and have conflict, and it's mild pain. But the point being, like, if people have this awareness, this self-awareness, this insight, and are explicitly talking about these things and can cooperate in something that I just got through a moment ago saying so complicated, it takes something that's super complicated and it can map it and track it. And that's just fucking awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been really super engaging to develop. And actually, that whole thing was my kind of orientation towards it, is we can help people figure out before they're 3 years in and they're like, oh shit, here we've got a very solid one-to-one bonder who is fully in love with a one-to-many bonder. That happens a lot. How do you, can you foresee that? Can you talk about it before someone's heart is broken? Maybe the one-to-one and the one-to-many, they could work that out potentially if they figure out, okay, so you're more flexible on sex, romance, and money are the big issues. You don't want me falling in love with someone else, and you don't want me paying for that person's rent. Okay. Oh, and how about co-parenting? You don't want me having children with other people, but I could have sex with other people. And you're not concerned about the kind of social aspect of, like, it's okay for me to have friends. It's okay for me to go, like, fishing with my friends. You hate fishing. You don't want to come. I'm not having sex while we're fishing. But, you know, some people who are like super one-to-one, they really don't want their partner doing other things without them. Like they are really very couple oriented.
Yeah.
That was confusing for me because sexually, sex and emotion for me are very closely wedded. And when I'm in love, I really only want that one person sexually. But socially, I want a lot of space and room. I love hanging out with my partner, but I don't want to be in that kind of monogamous relationship where I can't go have dinner with my friends without my partner. My partner has to go everywhere with me, or I can't travel by myself, or I can't, you know, whatever, like that. Some monogamous relationships are this kind of hyper monogamy. That doesn't work for me.
Sure.
But I don't want multiple sexual partners. So figuring, like, untangling the different ways and seeing them all and how they change over time is absolutely what we're trying to do with the bonding project. For the users on the back end with all the data, we are trying to figure out, like, how are people actually having relationships? What do they want? There is a measure of what's your ideal relationship and what's your relationship like right now? And how close or far apart are those? And if you want one thing, but you have another, what's keeping you from having those both be the same thing? Like, what's in the way of you having the relationship that you want? So we really want to use these data to help understand relationships, to help make, you know, we'll make these data publicly accessible to litigators and policymakers and lawmakers, you know, to kind of say, we've got a lot of policies and laws designed around a monogamous family, and that is quite popular still. But look at how all these other people are actually having relationships. And can we design laws and policies to serve the way people are actually living? Because a lot of our laws and policies, even though we say we have separation of church and state, a lot of our laws and policies are undergirded by this kind of Christian morality in a way that not everyone practices, and is really a religious basis in a country that claims no religion. So I would like to see a shift away from morality as the basis to ethics. I think we do need guiding principles about how we should treat each other and how we should interact. I'm not saying get rid of morality completely and everybody just do whatever you want, because that means strong people stomping on weak people. You know, that means all sorts of negative things. Like, society does have a stake in controlling and limiting behaviors to an acceptable range. I'm saying we can identify that acceptable range on the basis of shared ethics. It doesn't have to be a religious morality, because that religious morality does not fit. Not everyone has the same religious morality. We see that with, who is it okay to marry? Is it okay to terminate a pregnancy? You know, those are often, those things are guided by religious morality, when really, for me, that's an ethical issue. If you don't want an abortion or a multiple partner relationship or a same-sex relationship, that is absolutely fine. I'm not at all focused on in stuffing that down your throat. But your lack of desire for that does not mean this person over here should not be allowed access to abortion, same-sex marriage, multiple partners.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of ideas, or not ideas, reactions I have that I want to share with you. First of all, I have a lot of admiration. As I hear you sharing everything you're sharing, I'm like, God damn, I love having researchers. I'm never going to go get my PhD, but many colleagues of mine, they're like, Robin, you should get your PhD. I'm like, no. So I love, we were talking about, I can't remember the term you used about adjacent or parenting adjacent or whatever. I'm like, I'm academic research nerd adjacent. And I feel like I have to have you come back on the show, because I feel like I've just gone to an amusement park and I only got to go on 2 rides, and there's so much more that I want to go on. You know what I mean? So I just have a lot.
Great.
But I have a lot of admiration, because you're a clinician also. Right?
I'm a coach.
You're a coach.
I'm
We wanted to talk about. Okay.
I don't do the clinical.
Okay, great. But you're a coach, and we can talk about the differences of that. But my point is, so you're not just an academic researcher. You're in helping relationship with folks, with people, individuals. Yeah. You only see relationships, or do you ever see individuals?
Individuals are the folks who have a lot of issues around either my partner wants to be in an open relationship and I'm really freaked out about it, or I'm fine with having multiple partners, but when they go off with someone else, it hurts me so bad. What do I do? Or, I'll also see groups, individuals, couples, relationship groups, families with kids.
Right. Okay, so here, let me just close my point. Is one of the things that struck me and why I have a lot of admiration is the spirit of helping. Your spirit of helping permeates multiple layers. You're helping the someone who's not necessarily a direct consumer of your services. You're helping them by having something like the bonding project. You're also helping people as a direct consumer of your services. But then also your research, you're saying I have stuff this research can be used to help society at a policy and legislative level, and that's just in terms of scaling up, doing good. Like I'm just a little bit flabbergasted and admiration. When you admire someone, to me it's like it's a reflection about the things that you would like to be better at in your own life. So I just wanted to say that explicitly. And then in the time that we have, because we have a hard stop, and we have to bring this in for a landing soon, but come back. Will you come back?
Sure.
On the show? Awesome. Okay.
Sure.
So then let me just pick one thing, which is, I think I inadvertently or erroneously called you a clinician. You're a coach. So what's the difference between a coach and a counselor, or a coach and a therapist?
That's a really good question. Therapists are trained in how to help people uncover the trauma in their past, figure it out, and kind of mitigate its impact on their present, to see, why do I feel this way? Let me look back and kind of excavate and heal in a way from past, bringing it up to the present. My coaching practice very much starts in the present and moves towards the future. Much more, what's happening right now, is it working or not? What about it is working well? What about it is working poorly? What do you want to happen? And then I use research data rather than like, let me help you heal your past trauma. It's, okay, you want to do this thing. When other people have tried it, they've done these 7 different ways, and it works out in these various ways. Which of those might work for you? Oh, you're suggesting doing it this way? Well, when other people have done that, this is how it's worked out. So for instance, someone coming to say, well, I want to be able to have multiple partners, but I don't want my partner seeing, or they can have partners of a specific gender, but frequently it's a man saying, I want to have multiple women, but I'm not comfortable with my wife having multiple men. How do we work that out? And I will say, well, that's called the one penis policy. And generally that doesn't work over time. If it's a short step in potentially opening a relationship, that might work. But the expectation that you feel insecure about her being with other men. And the way to manage that insecurity is to limit her behavior. That doesn't work over time. If you really want multiple partners, the way to manage your insecurity is to look at your insecurity and deal with it. You know, you're expecting her to deal with her insecurity about you having multiple partners. This investment difference of she's got to deal with her feelings and you don't is not going to be sustainable over time. You know, it may be if she's the one that really wants the open relationship and she's bisexual or interested in women, then yes, maybe that's a step. But if you want to set that up as a permanent system that has low relationship satisfaction, low resiliency over time. And I've seen that with these instances. So it's much more kind of strategic and present and future focused. What are you doing right now? How is it working? What do you need to do to reach this present? You know, what do you want? And how do you want to reach it? And I see coaching and counseling actually coexisting together really well because they have different goals. Frequently, in order to reach those future goals, it really helps if you're able to deal with your past trauma and deal with maybe why have you made some of these choices. So I don't see them as, you know, one is better than the other, but therapists, or at least good therapists, are generally not saying, this is what you should do, client. You know, if a client comes to a therapist saying, what should I do? Frequently, the therapist will say, well, what do you want to do? Or what's important to you? You know, like turn the question back and help the client discover their own answers.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a coach is often more directive. I sometimes will give advice. I will give advice around, you may want to try that one penis policy, but if you're going to do it, I suggest a sunset date. Because if it just goes on and on, you know, I advise.
You're not going to beat the odds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I will give advice, direction, guidance in a way that it's really not appropriate for a therapist to do it, but I will not make any attempt. I can absolutely like acknowledge people's trauma and pain and sympathize with their emotions and give them space to express their emotions, but I don't have the skills or the training to say, let's go back and excavate that trauma and address it. That is therapy. And people have specific training and skills they develop to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And that's not my wheelhouse.
Yeah. Well, there's so much I want to say, but I want to just thank you again for coming on the show. And for listeners, anything that you want to, for people who want to learn more about your work and what you're up to, and how can they find out more about you and find you on social media, your website, things like that? You have new services or groups or anything, let people know. Yeah.
So my three primary websites that I would suggest, one, the Bonding Project is bondingproject.com. The other, I blog for Psychology Today under the title of my first book, The Polyamorous Next Door. And that's got a lot of, I've been blogging there for 10 years. There are hundreds of blogs that all focus on like little tidbits of research findings. So it's chopped up into little bite-sized pieces and it's free. So that's a great resource to find out more about not only polyamory and consensual non-monogamies, but now I've kind of branched out into positive sexuality in general. Mm-hmm. And then my website, elisabethsheff.com, is just how it sounds, only Elisabeth is spelled with an S, not a Z. ELISABETHSHEFF.com is a great place to find out about my relationship coaching, my expert witnessing practice. I'm moving over to chefconsulting.org. So if people want to find out more information about that practice, that'd be a good website to go to. It's not quite live yet. Maybe it will be by the time this post goes live.
Well, this post is going live on Sunday. So
okay, so yeah, not quite live yet.
yeah, but it's been just an absolute pleasure. I really want to say again, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
Me too. Thanks for having me. This has been a fun conversation.